Tonight's presentation is titled Ferry Permits, and our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is the president of Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management. He holds a CFI certificate, also an A&P mechanic certificate with inspection authorization. Mike's an author for numerous aviation publications, including a monthly column in the EAA Sport Aviation magazine. In 2008, Mike was honored by the FAA as Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year. Mike's a member of the EAA, and we're very thankful for Mike being with us and sharing his information in this continuing series that he is offering through EAA. Mike, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Well, good evening, Tim, and good evening, everybody. Tonight's subject, as Tim mentioned, is ferry permits. This is not quite as cool a subject as a lot of the things we talk about in this webinar series, but it is very important, and it's something that I find a lot of aircraft owners are a little bit intimidated by. So my hope tonight is to take the mystery out of ferry permits and show you just how easy they are actually to deal with. We in our aircraft maintenance business, we have the requirement to get ferry permits all the time, and it's not anything to get too upset about. Let's start at the beginning. Ferry permits exist to solve a problem, and the problem is that under the FARs, we're not allowed to fly an unairworthy aircraft. And it says so in FAR 91.7. Says no person may operate a civil aircraft unless it's in airworthy condition. Now, what exactly does that mean? The word airworthy is used all over the FARs, but it's not actually defined in the FARs. If you go to Part 1, where all of the definitions are in the FARs, you'll find definitions of all sorts of things, but you won't find a definition of the word airworthy, interestingly enough. So how do we know exactly what an airworthy aircraft is? Well, probably the best way is to pull the Airworthiness Certificate out of your aircraft. This is a standard Airworthiness Certificate. The experiment ones look a little bit different. And you'll see there's a lot of fine print on the Airworthiness Certificate. This is a relatively new one, and the fine print is on the front. On some of the older Airworthiness Certificates, the fine print is on the back side. But it all says the same thing. So let's take a look at what an Airworthiness Certificate has to say about airworthiness. I know the fine print's kind of hard to see, so I've sort of blown it up here. It says that for the aircraft to be airworthy, it has to be found to conform to its type certificate, and that it has to be in condition for safe operation. It also says that the Airworthiness Certificate is only effective as long as the maintenance, preventive maintenance, and alterations are performed in accordance with the relevant FARs. It cites Part 21, Part 43, and Part 91. And finally, the Airworthiness Certificate is only valid if the aircraft is registered in the U.S. If it's registered in some other country, then it needs to have an Airworthiness Certificate from that country. A U.S. Airworthiness Certificate isn't valid for aircraft that aren't U.S. registered. So just in summary, what it says in the fine print on your Airworthiness Certificate is that for the airplane to be airworthy, it has to conform to its type certificate and any relevant supplementary type certificates that might apply because the aircraft has had some modifications to it. It has to be in condition for safe operation. It has to be maintained in accordance with the FARs, and that includes, for example, being in annual and so on. And it must be registered in the U.S. Now that's for standard category aircraft. For an experimental amateur-built aircraft, the first bullet doesn't apply because experimentals don't have a type certificate to conform with, but all the other conditions still apply. It has to be in condition for safe operation, it has to be maintained per the regs, and it has to be registered in the U.S. So 91.7 says we're not allowed to fly an unairworthy aircraft, and now we know what unairworthy means. But the problem is there are times when we need to fly an unairworthy aircraft. And for example, if an aircraft goes out of annual, or an experimental aircraft is out of annual with regard to its annual condition inspection, that makes it unairworthy. It doesn't. It has not been maintained in accordance with the FARs, and therefore the airworthiness certificate stops being valid the minute that it goes out of annual. And if it happens to go out of annual in an inconvenient place, we need to be able to fly the airplane to whatever airport we want to have the annual inspection done. Or if the airplane gets damaged, and the damage occurs, let's say you have a prop strike or something, and it occurs at an airport that either doesn't have the facilities to do the repairs, or is just an airport that you don't want to have the repairs done. You want to move it to another place because you prefer a shop somewhere else. Then we're going to need to figure out a way to legally fly that aircraft to a place where the repairs can be made. And finally, if the airplane is unairworthy for some reason, either it's out of annual, or it is damaged, or something's wrong with it, and there's a hurricane about to hit the airport, we need to be able to move the airplane out of harm's way. And there has to be some legal way to do that. So in order to facilitate all of these things, we have to get permission to violate FAR 91.7 that says we can't fly an unairworthy aircraft. And to do that, we have to go to the FAA and get special permission. And that's what ferry permits are all about. The special permission is officially known as a special flight permit, which is a permit to fly an unairworthy aircraft. Colloquially, everybody calls them ferry permits. That's not what is written on them. They're called special flight permits, but the phrase ferry permit is universally used for these things. And so it's a ferry permit is special dispensation from the FAA to permit you to fly an unairworthy aircraft. Don't panic. It's not a big deal. A lot of people think that getting a ferry permit is a big deal. It isn't. We do it all the time, and it's just amazingly easy. The FAA really wants to help you out in this situation. So let's go through the actual procedure for obtaining a ferry permit. You decide you need to move the airplane. You need to fly the airplane. It's unairworthy for some reason. It's out of annual. It has a ding in the wing, or something. So how do we get a ferry permit? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to find an A&P who will inspect the aircraft to the point that he is satisfied that it is in safe condition to make the ferry flight that you want to make, and who is willing to give you a logbook entry saying so. This is a typical logbook entry that signed off by an A&P that says that I've inspected the aircraft and determined that it is in safe condition to make a ferry flight from wherever to wherever in accordance with a ferry permit. Now, keep in mind that for an A&P to sign off a safe to ferry logbook entry is very easy. You're asking him to use a very low standard. You're not asking him to say the airplane's airworthy. Obviously, if it was airworthy, you wouldn't need the ferry permit. You wouldn't need this logbook entry. All a safe to ferry entry means is that the A&P is convinced that the aircraft is safe to make one more flight. And typically, most ferry flights aren't real long. They can be, but most of the time, we're moving an airplane a relatively short distance from where it is in an unairworthy condition to where we want it to be in order to correct the airworthiness problem, either to repair the airplane or annual it or whatever has to be done. So you're only asking the A&P to certify that in his opinion the aircraft is safe to make that one more flight, maybe fly another 20 minutes. Not a very high standard. Once in a while, you may wind up being stuck somewhere where there isn't a local A&P available who will sign off the safe to ferry logbook entry. And if that's the case, you may need to make arrangements to get a mechanic to drive to wherever the airplane is, or even to arrange to have him flown in to wherever the airplane is, in order that he can lay eyeballs and hands on it to the extent that he deems necessary to make that safe to ferry logbook entry. Because without the safe to ferry logbook entry, you're not going to get the ferry permit, or the ferry permit won't be valid. The only alternative to getting an A&P mechanic to sign a safe to ferry logbook entry is to ask an inspector from the FSDO to come out and look at the aircraft. And trust me, you don't want to do that, and the FSDO guy doesn't want to do that. So do everybody a big favor and make sure that you have an A&P that will sign off this entry that says the airplane is in a safe condition to make this one additional flight. And the next step is you need to fill out a form and fax it to the FSDO. The form is FA Form 8130-6. The title of it is Application for an Airworthiness Certificate. Sounds like the wrong form, but it's really the right form for a ferry permit. It's a multi-purpose form that's used for all sorts of things, and one of the things the form is used for is applying for a ferry permit. And if you go online and Google FAA 8130-6, it'll take you right to a PDF file that you can download. That's a PDF fill-in form. So you can fill it out right on your computer screen and then print it out nice and pretty. Now, Form 8130-6 is fairly daunting looking. It's 2 pages long, and it has 8 sections labeled 1 through 8. But when you're applying for a ferry permit, you only need to complete 3 of those sections, section 1, 2, and 7, and you leave all the rest of it blank. So it really isn't that daunting a form when you're applying for a ferry permit. There's just most of the form you're just leaving blank, so it's not that big a deal. And I'll show you what it looks like and how you'd fill it out. But those 3 sections you fill out, section 1 describes the aircraft, gives its end number and serial number and make and model and so on. Section 2 just is a whole bunch of check boxes, and you check 2 boxes in section 2 to indicate that you're applying for a ferry permit and that the reason for the ferry permit is it's a maintenance flight to move the airplane to a place that maintenance can be done. Section 7 is really the heart of the form as far as the getting a ferry permit is concerned. And in Section 7, you identify who owns the aircraft, typically you. describe the proposed ferry flight, and explain why the aircraft isn't airworthy and needs a ferry permit in the first place. There's also a signature block there where you need to sign the form, and that's pretty much it. So let's just take a look at that. And I've just broken it up into slides for each of the 3 sections that you need to fill out. The first section is very short, and you just fill in the identifying information about the aircraft. This is one for November 54321. It's a Cirrus SR-22 2007 model, serial number 2345, and it's got a Continental IO 550N engine, and one of them, and a Hartzell propeller. So that's just the identification information for the airplane. Section 2, all you need to do is check those 2 check boxes. The checkbox on the left says I'm applying for special flight permit, and the checkbox on the right says the purpose of the special flight permit is for maintenance. So that's all you need to do in that section. And then the main stuff is in section 7, where you fill in information about you as the aircraft owner. You indicate where you want to fly the airplane, the origin and destination, and then you explain what it is that's making the aircraft unairworthy, that's causing you to apply for this ferry permit. Like, for example, the airplane is out of manual. It'll be all you need to say. And optionally, there's another place where you can describe any special operating restrictions necessary during the ferry flight. For example, if you had a problem with a retractable gear airplane and the retraction system wasn't working right, you might indicate that the ferry flight will be made gear down. A lot of the time, you just put none in that section because there aren't any special operating restrictions, but there is a provision to put those in. And then at the very bottom, you write your name and you sign. And so that's pretty much the form. And we'll take a closer look at that section so you can see how we filled out the form. In this case, the aircraft is owned by Mike's Air LLC, and we're proposing to fly the airplane from one airplane in the St. Louis area, one airport, I mean, CPS, to another airport, SUS, and we have a 10-day window that we would like the ferry permit to be valid for. The reason that we want to make the ferry flight is because the shop at CPS that was doing an annual feels that the cylinder is unairworthy because of low compression, and you don't believe it's unairworthy, and you want to fly it over to another shop and have them recheck the compression. Any special operating restrictions? No. And a signature at the bottom. So that's basically all that it takes to fill out an application for a ferry permit. This one is a little more elaborate than usual. I mean, a lot of the time it's just that the airplane's out of annual and we want to move it somewhere else to either do the annual, do a pre-buy, something like that. A lot of ferry permits are just for that reason. So once you finish filling out this form, and like I said, it's a PDF fill-in form, so it's really easy to fill out, you submit the form either by fax or email to the local FSDO, the one that has jurisdiction over the airport where the airplane is presently situated. And wait an hour or two after you submit the form to the FSDO, and then follow up with a phone call and see if anybody's working on it. If they're not, your phone call will prompt them to work on it. And most of the time, the FSDO will wind up faxing you back a ferry permit the same day. Pretty much the only time that's likely not to happen is if you give the FSDO inspector some reason for doubting whether the aircraft is safe to fly. And if you do that, then he may want to have a discussion with you, have a discussion with a mechanic, possibly even come out and look at the airplane. So the moral of the story is, don't give the FSDO guy a reason to doubt that the aircraft is safe to fly. If the airplane's out of annual, and that's why it's unairworthy, just tell him it's out of annual. Don't tell him it's out of annual. And by the way, the autopilot has been giving frightening pitch bumps for the last 3 months. Just tell him it's out of annual. Don't give him a reason to go looking for trouble. Now, sometimes owners want their mechanics to apply for the ferry permit for them. You can do that, but in order to do that, you will have to write and sign a letter that you give to your mechanic stating that you are the owner of the aircraft and you are authorizing the mechanic to apply for the ferry permit on your behalf. And then the mechanic will have to submit that letter of authorization along with the 8130-6 form. If anybody other than the owner signs the 8130-6 form, then the FAA is going to require a letter of authorization from the owner saying that the person who signed the form was authorized by the owner to apply for the ferry permit. Because technically the owner of the airplane is always the applicant for a ferry permit, and the ferry permit is issued to the owner. Now, when you get the ferry permit back, it can take two forms. The old way, back in the days when this usually was handled in person, and there were FSDOs, or before that GATOs, all over the place, and you usually just walked into the office, was that they would issue you a special airworthiness certificate, and that was your ferry permit. Nowadays, it's much more common to handle these things by fax or email, and the ferry permit that you'll get back, instead of being a special airworthiness certificate, will actually be a letter from the FSDO and that letter is the ferry permit. I'll show you an example of each of those. This is the older way, where you would actually get a special airworthiness certificate, and it would say the kind of special airworthiness certificate was a special flight permit, which means a ferry permit, and its purpose was maintenance and so on. And so you'd have this special airworthiness certificate to use in lieu of the standard airworthiness certificate, which is not valid because the airplane is not airworthy, to use for that ferry flight, and then you throw it away. Nowadays, the more common thing is to get a faxed letter. And here's an example of a faxed ferry permit. It's in the form of a letter from the FSDO, and we'll take a little closer look at it. Here's the top part of it, where it says that it's a special flight permit. The permit is for the following aircraft for a flight from CPS to SUS, and that this thing has to be displayed in the aircraft during the ferry flight, and that the ferry permit expires upon arrival at the destination, or something else. And then it has a list of operating limitations, and let's take a look at those. This is sort of the boilerplate that's going to be on most faxed ferry permits, with 7 operating limitations. And I know this is hard to read, so I'll put them up so you can read them. But these standard boilerplate restrictions, which are typically what you're going to get unless there's some unusual circumstance where you need them to change, is that the ferry permit will be restricted to day VFR only, that only the occupants of the airplane will be limited to the pilot and any essential flight crew, and for most of us that just means the pilot. that you are to avoid flight over congested areas, that you need that safe to ferry logbook entry by an A&P or a repair station saying that that the A&P or the repair station has determined that the aircraft is in safe condition to make the ferry flight. It says once again the ferry permit is good for only one flight. If it's a long flight, the necessary fuel stops will be included in the within the authorization of the ferry permit. But once you reach the destination, the ferry permit is done, and it's only good for the one flight. You can't make round trips with a ferry permit. All ADs that are required to be complied with before further flight must be complied with before you can make the flight with the ferry permit. If an airplane has an uncomplied with AD, and there's the ADs will typically say whether ferry permits are allowed or not to comply with the AD. But if there's an uncomplied with AD, then it gets a little bit more complicated to get the ferry permit, because the FAA is kind of sensitive to flying airplanes that that aren't in compliance with airworthiness directives. So sometimes you can do it. There are certain ADs where you're not allowed to do it, but it's going to have to get negotiated with the FSDO if you have an AD that needs to be complied with before further flight, and it's not complied with. That makes it a little more difficult to get the ferry permit. And finally, ferry permits are normally issued good for 10 days. If you don't make the ferry flight within that 10-day window, the ferry permit expires, and you need to go get another one. And again, that's probably negotiable, but 10 days is the normal window that they give you to make the ferry flight. One more very important comment, and then Tim, I'll be done with my prepared stuff. Do not make a ferry flight without calling your aircraft insurance agent. Most, or at least many, aircraft insurance policies state in the policy that they only provide coverage for the aircraft, at least in-flight coverage for the aircraft, if it's in airworthy condition. And of course, a ferry flight is flying an airplane in admittedly unairworthy condition. So what you need to do is call your insurance agent. Almost all underwriters will grant you coverage for a ferry flight, but you have to ask first. Normally it's not an automatic thing that's granted by your policy. It's something that has to be asked for specifically, and your agent needs to call the underwriter and get a memo that says you're covered for the ferry flight. So don't forget to do that before you make a ferry flight, so that you're sure that the airplane's insured just in case something goes wrong. And Tim, that's about all I have as far as prepared material. Why don't we open it up for some questions?
Fantastic. All right, that's the way I like to get through some of this dry material like this, maybe with a little bit of speed. First question from Jose. If a ferry permit is issued, does it become an official entry or part of the logbooks? I.e., does the ferry permit itself need to be logged in the logbook in addition to the condition for safe operation logbook entry?
No, it doesn't. It's the only thing that would appear in the logbook is the safe to ferry entry.
Okay. Paul's wondering, must a mechanic see the aircraft in the flesh, or will Skype videos or emailed photographs suffice to see the aircraft is in a condition for safe flight? Well,
the politically correct answer to that is that the mechanic has to inspect the aircraft to make the safe to fly entry. Now, off the record, I've seen lots of cases where uh, where an owner will call, will have a problem away from home, will call his mechanic, and they'll talk it over and maybe exchange some photographs, and the mechanic will give him a safe to fly entry without actually physically looking at the airplane. He's not really supposed to do that. But having said that, I've seen that happen on enough occasions that it's not unusual. So if your mechanic does that, he's going out on a limb for you, and he's doing you a big favor. Because if something goes wrong, he might have a lot of explaining to do.
All right, question here from Tim. He's wondering, how does all this apply when flying at 25 or 30% over gross? He says he's going to be flying his PA-34 around the world and will have extra fuel on board, and it's the only change in section 2.8 and over gross.
I don't believe that that ferry permits are the mechanism for doing that. I do know that the FAA routinely approves over gross operation for long distance flights, where there was, especially if the aircraft is tanked and so on. And it does require special permission, and I think it probably requires an experimental airworthiness certificate to be issued for the flight, but it's not considered a ferry permit. It's issued under a different rule, and it probably requires filling out an 8130-6, but not Section 7. It probably, I've never actually done one of those, so I don't remember all the details. But I think you need to apply for a special airworthiness certificate to make an over gross flight like that. But I don't believe that it's a special flight permit. I think it's a different kind of experimental airworthiness certificate that you get for flights like that.
Okay. Gary's wondering, what if an airworthiness directive is issued that mandates an inspection or repair that must be performed before the next flight? How does one ferry an aircraft with this restriction?
Well, if the AD states that the compliance must be before further flight and does not make allowances for ferry permits, then you're not going to be able to get a ferry permit, and you're going to have to, fly in or drive in a mechanic to comply with it. That's a difficult situation. We had a case like that come up. I can't remember whether it was last year or the year before, when Continental suddenly discovered that they had delivered a whole bunch of really bad hydraulic lifters that were coming apart at an alarming rate, and they wound up issuing a service bulletin and then going to the FAA for an AD, and it was one of these before further flight, no ferry permits permitted. And so when we saw that service bulletin come out, we advised our clients that we expected an emergency AD within a week or possibly less, and that it would behoove them to make sure their airplane was moved to a location where the lifters could be changed, because the service bulletin, of course, was not mandatory, but once the AD came out, that was mandatory, and you would be stuck wherever you were. So that situation doesn't come up that often, but when it does, it can be very inconvenient, because sometimes you do have these emergency ADs that give you no compliance time at all and just say, before further flight, no ferry permits are allowed. And this was one of them.
Daniel is wondering, do any of the FSDOs delegate the issuance of permits to DARs?
Yes, I should have mentioned that. A DAR is a designated airworthiness representative, and DARs are typically empowered to issue ferry permits on their own signature, representing the FAA, even though they're not actually FAA employees. DAR is to airworthiness kind of like, say, a designated pilot examiner is to taking flight tests, where the FAA doesn't have enough staff to do it themselves, and so they certify designees who don't actually work for the government but are given authorization to do some things that normally only FAA people are allowed to do. And DARs normally do have the ability to sign off ferry permits.
Cool. Gordon's wondering, do you have to have a fax, or will they email it to you?
Yeah, nowadays a lot of this stuff is done by email. If you look at the regs and you look at the FAA order that basically the Airworthiness Safety Inspector's Manual, it always refers to it as fax, and even on the letter it says faxed. But frequently nowadays we do it by email. As usual, the FAA's paperwork and regs and stuff are always a little bit behind the times. But yeah, we often do these things by email, and everybody just pretends it was done by fax as far as the regs are concerned.
All right. Ted asks, which comes first, the safe to ferry condition for safe operation logbook entry, or the application for the permit?
Well, technically the application for the permit comes first, and then the ferry permit you get basically says this ferry permit is not valid unless you have a safe to fly entry. And that's why when I teach this stuff, I always recommend making arrangements to get the safe to ferry entry first, because if once you get the ferry permit, you've got a 10-day clock ticking on you. So and sometimes it can be challenging to get to find a mechanic to sign off the safe to ferry thing. So it's always a good idea to get that all lined up before you apply for the ferry permit. But technically the ferry permit comes first, and the ferry permit says that as one of the operating limitations that the airplane may not be ferried until there's a safe to fly logbook entry made and signed. So technically that entry comes second.
Okay. Jim asks, standard restrictions include most direct route and avoid congested areas. What happens if you cannot comply with both?
To be honest with you, nobody really pays attention to those two things. Obviously, in the case that we were looking at, where we were flying from one St. Louis airport to another, literally every square inch between those two airports is congested, and obviously the FSDO inspector who issued the ferry permit wasn't bothered by that, because he knows perfectly well that the directory between those two airports is over almost nothing but congested areas, and that's just one of the things that people accept with a wink.
And Gordon asks,
You know, if you fell out of the sky into the congested area, then the FAA guy could say, well, we told him he's not to fly over a congested area, but nobody really pays much attention to those things.
okay, Gordon asks, does this same form or process apply to Part 91 Subpart F airplanes? And then he puts in parentheses jets as well.
Sure. There's nothing in this procedure that has anything to do with with what kind of aircraft it is.
Okay.
I mean, I assume it probably applies to anything from hot air balloons to multi-engine turbines. There's nothing about it that is particular to
Non-turbine jet.
yeah,
Non-turbine.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was a 91403F is what he's talking about, I think.
Subpart F, yeah.
Yeah, right. No, if the ferry permit, I imagine the same procedure applies with an airliner, actually.
Sure. I know one time I was looking to buy an experimental amateur-built aircraft, which was out of annual. And so I went through the process to get a ferry permit through the FSDO to get it up here. So it applies to experimental amateur-built aircraft also.
Yeah, and we do a lot of pre-buys, and we are frequently in a position where we need to do a pre-buy on an airplane that's gone out of annual, and we always have to get a ferry permit to do that.
Mm-hmm. I wonder about for the special light sport or experimental light sport. Wonder if a light sport repairman could do that condition logbook entry instead of an A&P mechanic.
I don't see why not, because what the requirement is that it be maintained in accordance with the applicable FAR. So if the applicable FAR say that the guy with the repairman certificate is allowed to do the annual condition inspection or whatever they call it on those airplanes, then that's all you'd have to do.
All right. Yeah, that makes sense. Dan's wondering, is it possible that the crew requirement could be waived to allow a passenger?
Well, you basically have to convince the FSDO guy that passenger was along for some good operational reason. You'd have a lot better luck asking for permission to let your mechanic fly along on the ferry flight than you would, say, your wife, probably, I'm guessing.
Jim's wondering if the aircraft is out of...
I mean, the language that they use is essential flight crew only, and so that leaves a little bit of wiggle room as to who's essential.
Sure.
I remember, this is just sort of an anecdote, but some years ago when my friend George Brawley was in the final stages of certifying his turbo normalizing conversion for the Cirrus SR-22, and I happened to stop by his place in Ada, Oklahoma, and he asked me if I'd like to go up in the airplane, and I said, of course I would. And the airplane was experimental because it was operating on a flight test production for a flight test ferry permit. And he says, well, for you to fly in the airplane, you have to be essential flight crew. So here's the deal. As a condition of going along on this flight, you see that gauge? Every 3 minutes, you have to write down what that gauge says. And I became essential flight crew.
Excellent. There you go. Okay, Jim's wondering if the aircraft is out of annual, does the date it went out of annual have to be included on the application, or is it adequate to simply state the aircraft is out of annual?
I think it's adequate to simply state that it's out of annual. I don't see why the FSDO would really have any interest as to what date the previous annual was done. It's just not even relevant.
Okay, let's see here. Richard asks, a pilot told me he bought a Cessna 310 and ferried it from California to New York. I was surprised that FAA would approve such a long flight. Have you ever heard anyone else getting a permit to do this?
Well, it's pretty unusual, but there's nothing in the rules to prevent it. If the guy had a good reason for doing that, and the FSDO Airworthiness Safety Inspector got up on the right side of the bed that morning, there's no official reason why that wouldn't be allowed. By the way, one thing I didn't mention, but it has come up, is that if that airplane flew from California to New York, that's on a ferry permit, that's fine, as long as he doesn't go into Canadian airspace. But another little gotcha is that a U.S. ferry permit is only good in U.S. airspace. We once had a ferry, it was actually a Cessna 310 as it turned out, from Toronto to Ohio. And to do that, we had to obtain a Canadian ferry permit and a U.S. ferry permit, because the U.S. ferry permit is only valid within U.S. airspace. So, and it wasn't very hard to do. Again, unless there's some real question about whether the airplane's going to fall out of the sky or not, the FAA, both the FAA and Transport Canada were quite happy to accommodate us.
Stephen says, I got declined for a ferry permit where the airspeed indicator was flaky, and I wanted to get the plane to a field where there was an instrument shop, as we were not positive that it was the instrument itself. We indicated it would be on a no-wind day, and there were two sources of ground speed, IFR GPS, to determine speeds. It was refused because the airspeed indicator was part of the type certificate data sheet and was required. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, of course, I don't know all the details about how that thing came down, but my initial thought is that in applying for the ferry permit, you told the FSDO more than you needed to. That was my point, is that you want to tell them, you want to avoid saying anything in your ferry permit application that would give them a reason to say no. If you just said that the airplane is out of pedostatic test, and you want to ferry it to a place where you can have the pedostatic test done, the chances are nobody would question that. But if you said that the airspeed indicator is unreliable, then that's giving the FSDO kind of an excuse to deny the ferry permit. And it's probably a luck of the draw which inspector you get, and whether he's okay with issuing it or not. But the less red flags you can raise in the ferry permit application, the better. That was why I was saying, for example, that if the airplane's out of annual, just tell them it's out of annual. Don't include the squawk sheet on the airplane, because that's not really what the FSDO needs to know.
And Joseph's wondering, if the aircraft is located in one FSDO area and wants to ferry it to its home FSDO, can the application be submitted to the home area FSDO?
It can't, unfortunately. That's something we often wish was possible, but the rule is that the ferry permit it must be issued by the FSDO that has jurisdiction over where the airplane is, where basically the origin of the ferry flight's going to be, not the destination. Unfortunately, you can't go FSDO shopping when you're applying for ferry permit.
Stephanie asks, beyond out of annual, what other conditions do you see would be applicable to get a ferry permit?
Well, I mean, we deal with all sorts of damage situations. For example, I mean, one of the most common reasons that we get a ferry permit is after a prop strike, where we wind up, getting a loaner prop, putting it on the airplane, and then flying it to a place where the engine can be pulled and go through a teardown, a post-prop strike teardown inspection. And but all sorts of things can trigger the requirement for a ferry permit. I mean, it's pretty common to be flying airplanes that have, like temporary duct tape repairs and stuff that are not technically airworthy, but they're good enough to make one flight with. And look, a lot of flights are made with unairworthy airplanes without ferry permits, and the pilot simply takes a chance that nobody will find out about it, and usually nobody does find out about it. We try to do everything as above board as possible, and because it's normally so easy to get a ferry permit, there's really not a good reason, usually not a good reason to take the risk of making a flight without it. And of course, the other issue that I brought up at the very end was insurance. That if you make a flight of an unairworthy airplane and something goes wrong, you may find yourself without insurance coverage unless you do stuff, openly, honestly, and above board, and do it the right way.
Good point. Michelle's asking, regarding the signature on the 8130-6, if a company owns the aircraft, should the signature be the corporate signature with title? Would this provide an additional corporate protection, maybe?
Well, the form, if the airplane is owned by a corporation, the form should either be signed by a corporate officer who's authorized to sign on behalf of the corporation, or if it's signed by somebody else, like the mechanic, then a corporate officer is going to have to write a letter of authorization to whoever it is who signs the 8130-6, and then that letter of authorization has to go along with the 8130-6, so that the FAA knows that that the owner of the aircraft, in this case a corporation, did authorize the application for the ferry permit.
And question from Richard. My annual was due October 2014. If I get a ferry permit and have the annual done February 2015, will the next annual be due October 2015 or February 2016?
February. And in fact, it's annuals always come due the last day of the month, so that it's very common that if you have an annual done in February, that we'll ask the IA to drag his feet and sign it off on the 1st of March, so that you, for all intents and purposes, get a 13-month annual. That's the way the regs work. It's always in calendar months.
Okay, and Michelle's wondering if you could please discuss what the AMP usually focuses on for the condition for safe operation logbook entry. You as an A&P, what would you inspect in order to sign off a ferry log?
Well, I mean, it depends on the circumstances. If the reason for the ferry permit is that the airplane went out of annual 3 days ago and it's been, flying actively for the past month, I'm probably not going to be too worried about it. I'm going to, if it's made all those flights, it's probably good for one more, and I'm probably going to just give it a cursory look-see, maybe an enhanced pre-flight or something, and sign off the entry. On the other hand, if the reason for the ferry permit is that that the airplane had a close encounter with a hangar of the worst kind, then I'm going to be looking awfully closely at the damage before I conclude that we can put some duct tape over it and ferry the airplane safely. So it really depends on the situation. Is the airplane damaged, or is it unairworthy for just some technical reason, like it's a few days, the annual expired a few days ago?
Okay.
And again, if the reason for the ferry permit is because there's a hurricane bearing down, I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at the airplane. I'm going to sign it off and run.
And just, we had a few more questions about AD compliance if an AD comes up and getting a ferry permit. Could you just review that one more time? So in other words, if there's an AD that comes up that says must be complied with before further flight, just talk about that a little bit more. We've had a couple more questions coming about that.
There aren't. It's exceptional for ADs to be worded as before further flight. Most ADs give a compliance period, and most ADs state in the postamble of the AD that ferry permits may be authorized to relocate the airplane to a place where compliance can be done. It's a fairly rare case where there's an AD, usually it's an emergency AD that's issued, without comment period and so on, that provides that compliance is required before further flight, and ferry permits are not allowed. Those are rare, but if there is such an AD and it applies to the aircraft, it may be impossible to get a ferry permit. The AD may need to be complied with wherever the airplane is, even if that's logistically difficult to do. Fortunately, they don't come up very often.
Okay, Paul's wondering, if you do a ferry flight for purposes of a pre-buy, is a second ferry permit necessary to fly it back home afterward?
Well, again, I don't have the full context here, but let's say the airplane was out of annual. We got a ferry permit to fly it somewhere, and there was a pre-buy, and then for some reason the prospective buyer decided not to buy it and walked away from the deal. The owner would have a choice of either having the shop that did the pre-buy complete an annual, which is usually the most cost-effective thing to do, since a good part of the inspection has already been done as part of the pre-buy. Or if he wants to bring it back home and have an annual done back home, then he would have to get a ferry permit, another ferry permit.
Okay, had somebody come in here with 21197. John just pasted in 21197. It looks like that's the special flight permits part of the regulation. Looks to be quite extensive here, but it looks like at the bottom A special flight permit may also be issued to authorize the operation of an aircraft at a weight in excess of its maximum certificated takeoff weight for flight beyond the normal range over water or over land areas where adequate landing facilities or appropriate fuel is not available. The excess weight that may be authorized under this paragraph is limited. So I think that relates to the around the world person.
Ah.
So
Well, I didn't realize that those were considered special flight permits, so I guess I just learned something.
I think that was Tim, and Tim came in here that he's got a website, Wings Around the World. He's departing June 1st from, let's see, he's departing NFO June 1st, and he's going to end his flight on Monday at EAA AirVenture.
Wow.
Quite a goal.
How cool is that?
Good luck, Tim.
Just don't send the fuel bill to me.
Okay, so Mark's wondering, excuse me, do I need a ferry permit for an out-of-date 411 and 413 currency trip?
Not necessarily, no. Most of the time you don't, because the altimeter one, I always forget which is 411, 413, but the altimeter one only applies to IFR flies. So if you fly VFR, it doesn't matter whether you're out of certs. And the transponder one simply says that you may not turn on the transponder if it's out of certs. So if you can make the flight VFR without a transponder, which would simply mean that if you either the flight is in airspace where the transponder isn't required, or if you are flying the airplane in airspace where the transponder is required, then you need to get an ATC to say it's okay, which is typically trivial. You just call the ATC facility and you say, I got a busted transponder and I need to fly into Long Beach. Can you accept me as a primary target? And they always say yes. I've done that a number of times. So you would need a ferry permit for that, because 411 and 413 actually are not airworthiness issues. An airplane that's not in 411 or 413 is not unairworthy. Those are simply operational restrictions that you can only fly in certain airspace with an operational transponder, and the reg says that if the transponder is out of certs, you're not allowed to turn it on. So it's simply an operational restriction. It's not an airworthiness issue.
Okay, Jim is wondering, suppose a new engine monitor is put in an airplane and during installation the airplane goes out of annual. Can you combine a test flight and flight to home base for the annual under a ferry permit?
Of course. I mean, you probably wouldn't say anything to the FSDO about what you're going to be doing on the flight except repositioning the airplane because it's out of annual. But if you want to check out the avionics or take pictures with your GoPro or whatever, that's your business.
Okay, Archie says in the old days the FAA would accept the mechanic's signature, an agent, rather than require the owner's signature.
Well, and I said they still do that, but they require that the owner provide a letter authorizing the mechanic to sign the form.
Okay.
And I think I suspect that's the way it's probably always been, but I know that's the way it is today, that if the signatory of the 8130-6 is anyone other than the aircraft owner, then the aircraft owner has to write a letter authorizing that person to sign the form. That's all it takes.
Okay. Jim asks, what if I'm away from home field when the aircraft goes unairworthy? My logbooks are at my house. Do I need to get the logbooks to the plane?
No. You don't even need to have logbooks. There's no regulation requiring that you have logbooks. All you need to do is have the safe to fly entry. It can be on a Post-it note. It can be on a square of toilet paper. It doesn't matter. The FAA only prescribes the contents of what maintenance record entries must be made. They do not prescribe the form of those entries. There's nothing in the regs that says they have to be in a book. There's nothing in the regs that say you have to have two different logbooks, one for the engine and one for the airframe. None of that is regulatory. All of that is simply by tradition. So if you wanted to keep your logbooks in the form of 3x5 cards, that would be absolutely legal. And there's absolutely no reason why you would ever need access to your logbooks to have some some maintenance entry done while you're on the road. That's why God invented self-adhesive stickers, because that's how we do those things. And then at some convenient time in the future, you can paste the sticker into the logbook if you want to, but that's a non-regulatory action. There's nothing that actually requires the logbook at all.
Okay, Michelle asks, would I need to give the name of the additional crew member or the non-owner pilot on any form? Sounds like she wants to have two people. Got second essential flight crew person. Would she need to give the name of that person anywhere on the form? Do you know?
I don't believe so. If you do nothing and say nothing, which is what I would recommend, the special flight permit will come back with a restriction that says that the occupancy of the airplane is limited to the pilot and any essential flight crew, and then it's up to you to decide who's the essential flight crew. And nobody's ever going to question it unless something goes wrong.
And Gary's got a question here. When notifying your insurance carrier of a special flight permit, you got any idea about what the insurance agent provides in the way of approving their coverage of a special flight?
I didn't really understand the question, but I think if you just provided the insurance agent with a copy of the 8130-6, that would probably have all the information that the underwriter could possibly need to grant you the coverage you need.
Okay, Mike. Well, we've reached the end of the questions here. We had some comments coming in, and quite a few comments thanking you for helping explain this subject here, and trying to put a little bit of light into a dry, dull subject. So good job, and thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, next time we'll get back into heavy, oily things, and but sometimes there are things like this that you just have to talk about because they come up, and they're just part of the business of keeping airplanes maintained.
Right, right. So a couple more thank yous, very informative. Fred came back with one here. Let's get this in. We got a couple minutes here. So Fred asks, Mike, wouldn't the application need the logs to review the AD status of the airplane?
Wouldn't the application?
Apparently, maybe he's thinking, wouldn't the mechanic who's doing the condition inspection need to review all ADs for the aircraft in order to provide the statement that says it's in a condition for safe operation?
No. That's not the case, and just think this through carefully. The mechanic's entry is not a certification of airworthiness. You are not asking the mechanic in this context, when you're asking him to give you a safe to fly entry, you are not asking him to assess the airworthiness of the aircraft. You're asking him to only assess whether it's in condition for safe flight. An AD is normally an AD is a technical requirement. It's effectively a change to the type certificate. And if the mechanic were performing an annual, he's absolutely required to assure that the aircraft is in compliance with all applicable ADs and that it conforms to its type certificate and all that kind of stuff. But you're not asking him to do that. All you're asking him to do is effectively do an abbreviated condition inspection. You're only asking him to certify that the aircraft is safe to fly, not that it conforms to any particular type design. The conformance to type design is only something that we have to do at annual inspection time. It's not something that we have to do to determine if an aircraft is safe to fly. In fact, you're required under 91.7 to determine that the aircraft is safe to fly every time you fly it. And you don't go do AD research every time you fly the airplane. In the case of a ferry permit, they're not willing to take your word that it's safe to fly. They're looking for a mechanic or a repair station to say that it's safe to fly. But that's all that he's being asked to do, is to determine that it's safe to fly, not that it's in compliance with anything. Now, the ferry permit itself states on it as a restriction that the ferry permit is not valid unless any AD that is required to be complied with before further flight has been complied with. But that's an operational limitation that you, as the pilot, are being asked to conform with. Not that the mechanic who gave you the safe to ferry logbook entry was required to do. So I know it's a little bit contorted, a little bit funny, but the FAA is not saying we're not going to issue the ferry permit unless you certify that all the ADs are complied with. They're doing it the reverse way. They're saying, here's the ferry permit, and one of the conditions of the ferry permit is that all the ADs have been complied with, and another condition is that there's a safe to fly logbook entry. And then it's up to you to decide, whether you're allowed to fly the airplane or not under that ferry permit. Does that make sense?
That was a fantastic summary, tying it all together.
Either that or I lost everybody.
Well, no, I thought it was great. I hope Fred thought it was great and answered his question. Richard just came in with one more, and this is really the last thing we have here. But thanks for the real-life explanation of how this works, says Richard. I have obtained 2 ferry permits and found them to be exactly as you have described.
Well, good.
It is an instance where the FAA is actually helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, as long as you don't give them some reason to be unhelpful, this usually goes very, very quickly. In dealing with the FAA, when dealing with FSDO people, you have to understand that they tend to be pretty risk-averse people. So you don't want to ask them to climb way out on a limb for you. And the best way to do that is to just make their jobs as simple as possible. Tell them only what they absolutely need to know, and typically you'll get the ferry permit back the same day, and you're good to go.
Fabulous. Well, that wraps it up from a question standpoint. Mike, would you like to make any closing comments?
Just kind of review the next 3 webinars in this series. In March, we're going to do one on CAM problems. On April Fool's Day, how did I wind up on April Fool's Day?
How did that happen?
Maybe I should think of some sort of a bogus webinar to do on April Fool's Day. But at any rate, we're talking about the decision point, which has to do with how owners need to interact with their IAs during annual inspections in order to keep control of the maintenance of their airplanes. Uh-oh. This is a bad slide. I know that the May one is not cam distress. It's something else. I'm sorry. This is embarrassing. I'm going to change the slide real quick.
Okay,
Well,
I
I'll
don't
have to
have the
figure out what the May one is.
update in
Sorry.
front of me. I can't tell you what it is right now. I don't have the list in front
Right.
of me.
I've got it somewhere too, but I obviously got distracted and didn't update the slide. And is finally I issue a free e-newsletter every month. Usually comes out usually the third week of every month on maintenance related things. If you're interested, you can either sign up at savvyaviator.com, or if you take the post-webinar survey, which I'm sure Tim would really like you to do, I think there's a checkbox on that survey that you can check, and you'll get on the mailing list for the newsletter. And finally, I'll just give one more plug for my book manifesto that you can find on Amazon.com. Just go to Amazon and search for Mike Bush Manifesto, and it's been getting some really nice reviews. I've been very happy with that, and it's available both in print and in a Kindle version if you prefer those. I am working on my second volume now, and I'm hoping that one will be done and in print by AirVenture if everything goes smoothly. So that's all I have for tonight, Tim.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was a fantastic webinar. We've gotten a lot of other comments from people thanking you for an excellent webinar, helping to explain this process in an understandable way. Fantastic job. Thank you so much. To all the attendees, thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Looking forward to having you tune in next week. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.